When we're working with programs, the general structure of a program is going to be something that takes in an input from a user, does some sort of computation or calculation on that input, and then provides back an output to that user that's sort of like the modified input based on what we're trying to do with our program. So one of the key things that we want to understand is, for one, how do we take an input from a user? And for two, how do we store that input to use it inside of our program? So the idea of this is essentially what is referred to as variables. Variables are a way to store data that's provided by a user or some sort of external source, or even provided by us. And essentially, it's a way of setting aside computer memory to be able to store a value to be able to use later. So I'm going to give you a very simple example. So if I go ahead and I type in something like this, x equals 2. What happens is we're setting up a variable called x. What we do is we set aside a piece of memory and we label it as x. And then we say that that piece of memory there is going to have the value 2. So what happens is we take 2, we put it into that piece of memory, and then later on in the program, if we reference the value x, what the computer or interpreter will do is it will go to that location in memory that's associated with x. It will take whatever value exists there, in this case 2, and it will bring it back and allow us to use it inside of the program itself. So a very simple example, when we were doing print before, you saw that we had something like print like hello or print hello world, right? You saw that this was in double quotes, right? The double quotes told the programming language that this is text. It's an actual string, right? So rather than using double quotes, what we can do is we can instead just put x here. And what will happen is, rather than just printing what's written there, it will take a look at this and it will say, well, x isn't text, which means that it must be a variable. So then it will go and it will check internally and it will say, well, what is associated with x? And it will find the location of x in memory, and then it will return back the value for x, which in this case is 2. So you'll see when I run this program, it outputs 2 to the screen because it takes a look at what x is supposed to be equal to. In this case, it's 2, and it prints out that value to the screen. So this is the general idea of variables. And we can, of course, manipulate variables and do all sorts of different things with them, and we'll take a look at that in great detail because that's really the whole idea of programming itself, is manipulating these variables. But we want to get a very good handle on these actual variables themselves. So there's a lot of different types of variables that exist. This should be something that we should discuss as well. So this is a specific numeric value, right? We would refer to this as an integer. It's a whole number that doesn't have any decimal point to it. If we add on decimal points, we can refer to it as a decimal or a floating point value. And you can see this prints out 2.12. If we put it in text, for instance, so I can put in double quotes and then put in hello world like we did before, this would be referred to as a string. A string is just a set of characters, so a whole bunch of letters put together. And you'll see when we run this, we actually get the same result as what we had earlier. We get the hello world printed out to the screen. Just in this case, it says x instead, right? Because x is equal to hello world. And then there's a third type of variable that is fairly useful to us, and it's known as a Boolean. A Boolean can take on two different values. It could be either true or it can be false. So for instance, if I type in true here, that would be an example of a Boolean value. And you can see I can print that out as well, and it will say true. The other one would be false, right? And essentially, this just allows us to keep track of a status of something, basically. We can say, is this thing true? Is this thing false? And we'll discuss a bit about that as well. For instance, a good example of this would be if we have two variables and we want to check if they're equal to each other, we can check the equality of them. So we can say, does x equal y? And essentially that will be either true or false. Either x equals y or x doesn't equal y. So you can see there's a lot of scenarios where we can have that sort of binary or Boolean type of variable where it's either true or false. So these types of variables will come up very often as well. So those are the three that are very common and good to know about, and I'll sort of introduce more as we go along, but those are three sort of foundational ones that are really nice to know. So understanding these different types of variables, let's take a look at how we can take user input. If we want to take user input, we're going to set a variable. Say we'll just keep it as x, and we're going to set it equal to the following. We'll say input. And then what we do is we provide a prompt inside of the brackets. So I can say, for instance, please enter a number, right? Now when we run this, let's see what happens. you'll see it says, please enter a number, and it's going to wait. It's going to wait for us to actually input something into the terminal or command line, right? So if I input, for instance, 10, you'll see that it prints 10. What happens is x was set equal to whatever I inputted, and then this prints out the value of x, in this case, the thing that I inputted, which is 10. So this sort of demonstrates how variables can work in a realistic sort of scenario. And this hopefully demonstrates why you would want to use variables, because if you don't have user input, it really just looks like we're assigning it to a value. We could have just changed it to the value instead of using the variable. But with user input, we're able to make a more dynamic program where someone inputs something in, and then that gets outputted to the screen. So this is the general idea of that. And you can see that no matter what we change this prompt to, it will always output whatever the prompt is. So I can select, please input a string, for instance. And when I run this, then we can type in something, I don't know, like, hello, how are you? And you can see it just prints out exactly what we asked it to print out. So this is the general idea of taking input. So there are now two different functions that you know inside of Python. The input function, which allows you to take input from a user and you provide it with a prompt. And the print function, which allows you to print the value that you provided to the screen. So you do print, you put in a value, and it will print out that value to the screen. So you can see in this case, we have a variable x. We set it equal to the input that's provided by the user. The user prints the input, and then we print out whatever the user inputted to the screen. So this is a very general flow that utilizes variables and inputs and gives you a bit of an idea of how those different features work inside of Python.